Millionaire spots beggar mom with twins. His next move stuns all. Air in New York bit at Mason Brooks' skin as he strode through the chaos of Times Square. A frigid November wind slicing through the seams of his tailored black overcoat. Neon lights pulsed overhead, bathing the streets in a garish glow, reds, blues, and yellows clashing against the gray dusk. Horns blared, vendors hawked steaming pretzels, and a sea of hurried strangers jostled past, their breaths fogging in the cold. At 35, Mason was a millionaire carved from ambition and solitude, his sharp jaw set against the world, his hazel eyes hardened by years of calculated deals and empty penthouse nights. This city was his empire, a glittering cage he'd built brick by brick, yet it never warmed the hollow space beneath his ribs. He was late for a meeting, some overpriced dinner with investors he'd rather avoid, when his gaze snagged on something. In the crowd, amid the blur of overcoats and briefcases, a figure slumped against a graffiti-streaked wall, a tattered blanket draped over her knees. Her hair hung in greasy tangles, half shielding a face etched with exhaustion, and beside her sat two tiny girls, twins no older than 3, their threadbare jackets barely clinging to their shivering frames. One sobbed softly, her small fists rubbing red-rimmed eyes, while the other clung to her mother's arm, her wide stare darting like a trapped animal's. "Hush, Emma," the woman murmured, her voice a fragile thread of love stitched with despair. "Someone will help us soon, baby. Chloe, stay close." Mason froze, his polished loafers rooted to the cracked pavement. That voice had clawed at a buried corner of his memory, dragging up a name he hadn't spoken in years. Ava Harper. His pulse quickened as he squinted through the dim light. The dirt, the hollow cheeks, the lines of suffering couldn't hide it. It was her, the girl who'd once ruled their high school like a queen, her laughter bright and cutting, her dark eyes dismissing him, a gangly, awkward kid who dared to adore her from afar. She'd mocked his stuttering confessions, her friends snickering as he shrank into himself. Now, here she was, a ghost of that radiant past, broken and begging on a street he owned. "Ava?" His voice cracked, disbelief warring with the ache blooming in his chest. She lifted her head slowly, as if it weighed too much, and those same dark eyes met his widened, then flinched away. "Masim?" she whispered, barely audible over the city's roar. Shame flooded her face. She tugged the twins closer, shielding them from his stare. Emma's whimpers grew louder, a knife twisting in Mason's gut, while Chloe's silent gaze pierced him, pleading and accusing all at once. "What happened to you?" he asked, stepping closer, his shadow falling over them. The question hung heavy, raw with a concern he hadn't felt in years. Ava's lips trembled, her grip tightening on her daughter's. "It doesn't matter. We're fine. Just go." "But—" Mason couldn't move. The sight of her starved, shivering, a mother clinging to hope shattered the cold armor he'd worn so long. Emma's cries echoed in his ears. Chloe's frail fingers clutched Ava's sleeve. They weren't fine. Not even close. "You're not fine," he said, voice low and firm, cutting through her protest. "Come with me. I'll help you and the girls." Ava shook her head, pride flickering in her sunken eyes, but Mason crouched down, leveling his gaze with hers. "I'm not leaving you here," he insisted, his tone brooking no argument. "Not like this." Her resolve wavered, teetering on the edge of collapse. The twin shivering forms pressed against her, and finally, with a defeated nod, she surrendered. Mason stood, extending a hand she took with trembling reluctance, and in that moment, the past crashed into the present, pulling them both toward an uncertain dawn. The sleek black Bentley purred through the neon-drenched streets, its leather seats swallowing Ava Harper and her twins in a cocoon of unfamiliar luxury. Mason Brooks sat across from them, his sharp profile illuminated by the passing lights. a statue of resolve carved from the chaos outside. Ava clutched Emma and Chloe tighter, their small bodies trembling against her, their wide eyes darting between the plush interior and the man who'd pulled them from the gutter. The hum of the engine filled the silence, a low rumble that couldn't drown out the tension crackling in the air. Emma whimpered, burying her tear-streaked face in Ava's tattered coat, while Chloe's fingers twisted the frayed hem of her sleeve. Her quiet resilience a mirror to her mother's fraying strength. Ava's gaze flickered to Mason, then away, her jaw tight with a mix of shame and defiance. She didn't belong here, not in this car, not in his world. The last time she'd seen him, she'd been perched on a pedestal of teenage arrogance, tossing barbed laughter at his clumsy affection. Now, she was a beggar in his kingdom, and the irony stung like salt in an open wound. The car glided to a stop before Mason's mansion, a sprawling fortress of glass and stone rising against the night sky. Warm light spilled from arched windows, casting golden pools across the manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the icy pavement they'd left behind. Mason stepped down, offering a hand Ava ignored as she slid from the seat, hoisting Chloe onto her hip. He scooped up Emma instead, her tiny frame limp with exhaustion, and Ava's lips parted in protest, but she swallowed it. She had no fight left to give. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and faint lavender, the kind of quiet wealth that pressed against Ava's skin like a judgment. The forest stretched upward, a chandelier dripping crystals overhead, its glow catching in Chloe's awestruck eyes. Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper, emerged from a shadowed hallway, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality. "Rooms are ready, sir," she said, her voice soft but clipped. "Shall I bring food?" "Yes," Mason replied, setting Emma down gently on a velvet sofa. "Something warm. And clothes for the girls." Mrs. Harper nodded and vanished, leaving them in a silence thick with unspoken questions. Ava sank beside her daughters, her hands trembling as she smoothed Chloe's tangled hair. Mason stood by the fireplace, its crackling flames painting his face in shifting oranges and golds. He watched her, the weight of his stare pulling at the edges of her composure. "Thank you," she murmured finally, her voice barely above a whisper, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Really, Mason, thank you." He nodded, but his mind churned. This wasn't the Ava he'd known, the girl who danced through high school corridors like she owned them, her confidence a blade that had sliced through his teenage heart. That Ava wouldn't be here, shivering in rags, her pride crumbled to dust. "What happened?" he asked, stepping closer, his tone gentle but insistent. "Tell me." Ava's shoulders stiffened, her gaze dropping to the floorboards as if they held the answers she couldn't face. "It's a long story," she said, her voice hollow. "We're fine now. That's what matters." "You're not fine," Mason countered, crouching to her level, his hazel eyes locking with hers. "You're starving. The girls are freezing. I need to know, Ava." She bit her lip, the dam of her resolve cracking under his scrutiny. Emma stirred, curling closer, and Chloe's small hand found hers, a lifeline in the storm of memory. "After graduation," Ava began, her words slow, jagged. "I fell for Tyler Evans. You remember him, captain of the football team, everyone's golden boy." Mason's jaw tightened. He remembered Tyler all right, a swaggering prince who trampled anyone in his path, including Mason. "We dated after prom," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I thought it was love. Then I got pregnant. I told him, expecting, I don't know, something, but he walked away. Said he wasn't ready, that it wasn't his problem." Her fingers clenched around Chloe's, knuckles whitening. "My parents couldn't help. Dad was sick, Mom barely scraping by. I tried to make it work, got a job waitressing, but then I lost it. Bills piled up, and when the girls were 2, we got evicted. Been on the streets ever since. The words hung heavy, a confession carved from years of struggle. Mason's chest burned with a fury he hadn't felt in years, not just at Tyler, but at the world that had let her fall so far. He saw the twins' pinched faces, their innocence battered by a life they didn't choose, and something snapped. Inside him, "You're staying here," he said, standing abruptly, his voice a steel thread. "You and the girls. I'll help you get back on your feet." Ava's head jerked up, disbelief warring with exhaustion. "Why, Mason? After everything how I treated you back then? I don't deserve this." He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her again, his hands resting lightly on her knees. "Because I can't walk away from you like he did," he said, his voice raw, unguarded. "Not when I see you like this. Not when those girls need someone. I don't care about the past, Ava. I care about now." Her breath hitched, tears spilling over as she searched his face for a lie and found none. Emma stirred awake, her soft cry breaking the moment, and Ava pulled her close, rocking her gently. Chloe nestled against her other side, her silent trust a weight Mason felt in his bones. Mrs. Harper returned then, bearing a tray of steaming soup and fresh bread, the aroma wrapping the room in a fleeting warmth. "Eat," Mason said, stepping back, giving her space. "Rest tonight. We'll figure it out tomorrow." Ava nodded, too drained to argue, and as she spooned broth into Emma's mouth, Mason watched from the hearth, the firelight dancing in his eyes. He didn't know what tomorrow held, only that. He'd just tethered himself to a woman he'd once lost, and 2 little girls who'd already begun to crack the ice around his heart. The morning sun crept through the heavy curtains of Mason Brooks' mansion, spilling soft gold across the hardwood floors where Ava Harper stood, barefoot and hesitant. She wore a borrowed robe, its silk whispering against her skin, a stark contrast to the coarse rag she'd clung to for years. Downstairs, the clatter of dishes and the faint giggle of Emma and Chloe drifted up, a sound so foreign it tightened her throat. For the first time in months, her girls had slept on a real bed, their small bodies cocooned in crisp sheets instead of shivering under a threadbare blanket. It should have brought relief, but instead, a knot of unease twisted in her gut. This wasn't her life, it was Mason's, and she felt like an intruder teetering on borrowed grace. Mason appeared in the doorway. His crisp white shirt rolled to the elbows, a tray of coffee and toast balanced in his hands. "You're up," he said, his voice low, steady, like the anchor she'd never had. He set the tray on a side table, his hazel eyes catching hers, with an intensity that made her look away. "The girls are with Mrs. Harper. They're happy." Ava nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she glanced toward the laughter echoing from below. "They've never had this," she admitted, her fingers tracing the robe's hem. "A warm room, a full stomach. I couldn't give them that." "You did what you could," Mason said, stepping closer, his presence solid yet unintrusive. "Now let me help." "Stay here, Ava. Let me get you back on your feet." Her eyes flicked up, searching his face for pity, but found only resolve. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice edged with the wariness of someone who'd been burned too often. "No catch," he replied, his tone unwavering. "Just a chance." Over the next few weeks, Mason turned his words into action. He bought Emma and Chloe bright totes and sneakers that squeaked on the polished floors, their delighted squeals bouncing off the mansion's high ceilings. He set up a desk in the study for Ava, piling it with books on business and a laptop she stared at like it might bite. "You've got a sharp mind," he told her one evening, leaning against the doorframe as she frowned at a spreadsheet. "You just need a push." "I don't even know where to start," she said, rubbing her temples, the weight of her ignorance pressing down. "Start anywhere," he countered, sliding a chair beside her. "I'll figure it out with you." He hired her as an assistant at Brooks Enterprises, a role small enough to ease her in, but real enough to spark something in her, a flicker of the confidence she'd lost. She stumbled at first, her hands shaking as she typed emails, but Mason's quiet encouragement steadied her. "You're doing fine," he'd say, his voice a lifeline through the fog of self-doubt. And slowly, she was. The twins thrived too. Emma's chatter filled the garden as she chased butterflies, while Chloe's shy smiles bloomed when Mason knelt to tie her laces. The mansion, once a sterile monument to Mason's success, soft under their presence. Evenings became a patchwork of small moments. Mason sprawled on the rug with Emma and Chloe, building block towers that toppled in fits of laughter. Ava watching from the couch, her guarded heart cracking open at the sight. He was patient, steady, a man who'd once been a stranger, now weaving himself into their lives. She felt it a pull she couldn't name, a warmth that scared her as much as it drew her in. But trust came hard. One gray afternoon, as Ava sorted files in Mason's office, her phone buzzed on the desk, a cheap burner she'd kept from the streets. A photo loaded. Mason at a restaurant, leaning close to a sleek brunette in a tailored suit, her smile sharp and intimate. The caption read, "Do you really know him?" Ava's stomach dropped, her fingers trembling as she stared at the image. Memories of Tyler's betrayal clawed up her throat. The lies, the abandonment. Was this the same? Another man too good to be true? That night, she found Mason in the living room, the fire casting long shadows across his face as he read. The twins slept upstairs, their soft snores a distant comfort. She held out the phone, her voice tight. "Who is she?" Mason's brow furrowed as he took it, studying the photo. "Jessica Lane," he said after a moment, his tone even. "She's a consultant on a project logistics for a new branch. That was a business lunch last week." He handed the phone back, meeting her gaze. "Who sent this?" "I don't know," Ava snapped, her fear sharpening into anger. "Some number I don't recognize. Why would they send it to me, Mason? What are you hiding?" He stood, closing the distance between them, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Nothing, Ava, I swear. Look, I fired a guy a few months back, Greg Tanner. He was bitter, made threats. I'd bet my last dollar this is him stirring trouble." He pulled out his own phone, scrolling through emails with brisk efficiency. "Here, proof of the meeting. Timestamps, receipts. Check it if you want." She took the device, her pulse slowing as she skimmed the evidence. A calendar invite, a payment stub, all mundane and irrefutable. The brunette's smile faded into context, a professional exchange, not a betrayal. Ava exhaled, handing it back, her shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," she murmured. I've been lied to before. It's hard to believe in this in you." Mason's expression softened, his hand hovering near hers before settling on the armrest. "I get it," he said quietly. "Tyler did a number on you. But I'm not him, Ava. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, really looked past the polished exterior to the man who'd knelt in the dirt to comfort Chloe, who'd stayed up late deciphering tax forms with her. The firelight danced in his eyes, and for the first time, she saw not just the boy she'd scorned, but the man who'd chosen her despite it. "I want to trust you," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying." "That's enough for." "No," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We've got time." Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, a gentle drumbeat sealing their fragile truce. Ava sank onto the couch, the phone forgotten in her lap, and Mason sat beside her, not too close, but close enough. Emma's crayons littered the coffee table. Chloe's stuffed bear slumped against a cushion. These were their traces, there. Roots sinking into this place and into him. Ava's chest ached with something new, not fear, but possibility. And as the storm whispered beyond the glass, she let herself lean, just a little, toward the man who was rewriting her story. The late autumn dusk hung heavy over New York, a bruised sky streaking purple and gray above the city's jagged skyline. Ava Harper stood outside a dingy bar on the Lower East Side, her breath fogging in the chill as she steeled herself for what lay ahead. The neon sign flickered, rusty anchor, its buzz a grating hum against the distant wail of sirens. Mason had offered to come, his steady voice promising support, but she'd shaken her head. "This is mine to finish," she told him, her dark eyes resolute. Now, clutching her coat against the wind, she pushed through the door, the stale stench of beer and regret hitting her like a slap. Tyler Evans slouched at a corner table, a shadow of the golden boy she'd once loved. His once chiseled jaw was softened by stubble and too many late nights, his blue eyes dulled under the bar's dim lights. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat before him, amber liquid catching the flicker of a cheap bulb. He looked up as she approached, surprise flashing across his face before settling into a lazy smirk. "Ava," he drawled, leaning back. "Been a while." She stood stiffly, hands balled in her pockets, the weight of years pressing against her ribs. "I'm not here for small talk, Tyler," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the bar. "I came to say something for Emma and Chloe." His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. "What about them?" "They're mine," she said, stepping closer, her tone sharp as a blade. "You walked away when I needed you most. Left us with nothing. I don't expect you to care now, I never did. But they deserve to know I tried. That I stood here and faced you, even if you're too much of a coward to face them." Tyler's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming the table. "I wasn't ready, Ava. I told you that. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry?" He shrugged, a hollow gesture. "I'm not. I moved on. You should too." The words stung, a dull echo of the betrayal that had shattered her world. But instead of breaking her, they hardened something inside anger, giving way to clarity. "I have moved on," she said, her voice steady now, rising above the bar's din. "They've got someone who loves them like you never could. Mason's more a father to them than you'll ever be." She turned, the air lighter with each step toward the door. "Goodbye, Tyler." Outside, the wind whipped her hair as she exhaled, a weight lifting from her chest. The past wasn't hers to carry anymore. It was his to rot with. She walked back to the mansion, the city's lights blurring into a constellation of new beginnings. That night, Mason waited on the mansion's rooftop terrace, the skyline sprawling below like a sea of stars pinned to the dark. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. He'd asked Ava to meet him here, his hands restless in his pockets, a small velvet box burning against his palm. When she stepped through the glass doors, her coat dusted with the evening's chill, his breath caught. She looked different, lighter, as if she'd shed an invisible chain. "You okay?" he asked, stepping toward her, the terrace's string lights casting a soft glow across his face. She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I saw Tyler. It's done." Mason's eyes softened, pride flickering in their depths. "You're stronger than you know, Ava." She looked out at the city, its pulse a steady hum beneath them. "Maybe I'm starting to believe that." He took a deep breath, the moment swelling between them like a tide. "Ava," he began, his voice low, trembling with something raw. "I've been thinking about this about us for a long time. That night I found you on the street. I didn't just see the girl I used to know. I saw someone I couldn't let go of again." He pulled the box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple diamond ring, its facets catching the light like captured fire. "I love you. I love Emma and Chloe. I want us to be a family forever. Will you marry me?" Ava's breath hitched, her eyes widening as tears welled, shimmering under the terrace lights. The wind tugged at her hair, the city's heartbeat fading into the roar of her own. She saw Mason not the boy she'd dismissed, but the man who'd rebuilt her world, piece by patient piece. The fear that had held her back melted under his gaze, replaced by a certainty she hadn't felt in years. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking as she stepped into his arms. "Yes, Mason." He slipped the ring onto her finger. "It's cool." Weighed a promise against her skin and pulled her close. Their lips met, soft and fierce, the taste of salt and hope mingling as the city stretched endless below. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a storm passing by, leaving only the quiet of their shared breath. In that embrace, Ava felt the past dissolve, and Mason found the home he'd never known he'd been searching for. Spring unfurled over Mason Brooks' mansion like a tender promise, the garden bursting with lilacs and daffodils under a sky of endless blue. On a sun-dappled afternoon, Ava Harper stood beneath a simple arch of woven branches, her white dress flowing soft as a whisper against the grass. The ceremony was small, just Mrs. Harper, a handful of Mason's closest colleagues, and the twins, Emma and Chloe, who scampered ahead as flower girls, their baskets spilling petals in haphazard trails. Ava's dark eyes shimmered as she walked toward Mason, his broad shoulders framed by the arch, his smile a quiet beacon pulling her home. "I promise to stand by you," Mason said, his voice steady as he slipped a gold band onto her finger. Through every storm, every dawn. Ava's hands trembled as she echoed his vow, her ring glinting in the sunlight, a circle of trust forged from their fractured pasts. When their lips met, the small crowd cheered, but Emma and Chloe's gleeful squeals drowned them out, the twins barreling into their arms with sticky hugs. Laughter rippled through the air, a sound as bright as the blooms around them, and for Ava, it was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. The mansion, once a cold monument, hummed with new life. Emma's drawings plastered the fridge. Chloe's stuffed bear claimed a permanent spot on the couch, and Mason's once silent evenings now echoed with bedtime stories and the patter of little feet. Ava settled into this rhythm, her heart swelling with a peace she'd never known. Mason was her rock steady, unwavering, his love a thread weaving their family tighter each day. Months later, as summer painted the garden in bold greens, Ava felt a flutter beneath her ribs, a secret she carried with tentative joy. One evening, she found Mason in the nursery they'd begun to plan, his hand smoothing the edges of a crib he built himself. The twins slept down the hall, their soft snores a gentle backdrop. "Mason," she said, stepping close, her voice a mix of nerves and wonder. "I'm pregnant." His hand stilled, his hazel eyes lifting to hers, wide with disbelief that melted into a grin. "A baby?" He breathed, pulling her into his arms, the scent of sawdust and his cologne wrapping around her. "Our baby." Tears pricked her eyes as she nodded, and when their son arrived, a squalling bundle with Mason's eyes and Ava's stubborn chin, Emma and Chloe crowded close, promising to be the best big sisters. The mansion glowed that night, its windows spilling light into the dark as Mason cradled their newborn, Ava leaning against him, the twins sprawled asleep nearby. From a frostbitten street corner to this, a family bound by love, resilience, and second chances, they'd built something unbreakable. Ava traced her son's tiny fingers, her heart full, and beside her, Mason whispered, "We made it." Together, they had turned pain into promise, proving that even in the deepest shadows, trust could bloom into forever.